So while we're talking about practice, as you know, our focus today is going to be on the as practice approaches to social science inquiry, especially their methodology and their methods. And we'll be devoting a lot of time to helping many of you who are in early stages of research in this field assemble an approach for inquiry into these fields, but especially in our area of expertise, which happens to be leadership as practice. So our session will be divided into 3 segments. First, the 3 of us will present our 3 perspectives on the as practice fields, divided into macro, meso, and micro. And then we'll invite, as the second segment, some works in progress and comment on ways to cultivate a leadership as practice perspective. And then thirdly, we're going to open it up to a free and full dialogue on any questions and comments that you'd like to bring up, kind of consistent with our as practice approach. So our team has decided not to take up any time on biographies, but I'm briefly going to introduce them here and then mention our roles in the webinar. So I'm Joe Raelin, currently the Donald Gording Visiting Professor of Leadership at the University of Cape Town, where unfortunately, because of the pandemic, I have yet actually visited in Cape Town. But I'll be covering the macro level of inquiry, considering how LAP can be viewed as a process-based, non-individualized, emerging dynamic offering unique opportunities for fresh scholarly development. Marian Iszatt-White will come on next. She's a senior lecturer in the Department of Entrepreneurship and Strategy at the Lancaster University Management School. And she'll be addressing the meso level, discussing her ethnomethodologically informed ethnography. Good thing I didn't have to say that 3 times, Marian. Recognizing the grossly observable and surfacing it as a resource for theorizing. And third up will be Jenny Robinson, visiting lecturer at Cranfield, who also in her spare time runs 3 UK-based organizations, including an alpaca farm. And by mentioning that, I guess, Jenny, you're going to have to field questions on alpacas. Anyway, she'll be offering a micro-level demonstration using a video ethnographic method, which might very well end with her paradoxical challenge. If she doesn't say anything about it, you ask her, how can individuals have leader in their title but fail to achieve leadership? Okay, so I'm then going to begin with my segment on the macro perspective. So to begin, you can see here the cousins we have in the as practice domain: strategy as practice, entrepreneurship as practice, and so on. And what is common across these as practice methods is that instead of focusing on performance effects, they're interested in an in-depth analysis of what actually takes place. You might say the sayings and the doings in their respective fields. But there are some slight differences. For example, let's pick strategy as practice. SAP tends to focus quite a bit on stability and recursiveness, especially on structures that constrain attempts to deviate from routines. LAP, on the other hand, we tend to focus mostly on change and adaptiveness. Also, in LAP, we de-emphasize the role of individuals, such as leaders, for example, focusing mostly on practitioners' interactions among themselves and in conjunction with their cultural artifacts. So I'll get into a little bit more of this as we go. Okay, so an overview of LAP first. We don't look for leadership in people then, again, not focusing on the individual so much, especially in leaders' heroics. We look for it in everyday practice. And not only in the interaction between people, but in unfoldings happening in the moment. So we like to say when social processes change the trajectory or the turning points in the flow of practice, that's when leadership is occurring. So how many of you like jazz? I actually can't see hands or anything, but anyway, if you do, let me take a little break here. So very much like the jazz band, you know, especially free jazz, the directions the tune will take are decided in the moment of playing and are often redetermined each time the piece is played. Okay, hope you like that little interlude. Over here on the this side of the world, we're waking up, so this helped us. Anyway, the other thought I'd like to bring to the table is that we're a constructionist approach. And so we believe if we can reflect on our practice, we can reconstruct it in light of our reflections and on behalf of our mutual interests. So why should we study leadership as a practice? So remember, we're studying leadership as a practice, not just leadership practices. So we're interested in changes occurring in the flow of practices that you see there. So let's say we want to study the normative conditions of democracy. It might be nice first to describe and understand the embodied and the collaborative, meaningful accomplishments of people first, because we need to study as much as we can about how interdependencies, you know, not just between ourselves, but between us and a whole range of embodied performances, how they all shape leadership. So some examples. How do we change our collective minds? Why do we at times hum along in our groups like a single instrument, and other times disagree so vehemently that we even break off? And then how do we rectify those ruptures? What happens when our body tells us one thing and our mind another? Why does a PowerPoint display work in shaping leadership at one time and not in another? What's the significance in your culture of having a dinner with a client? Okay. Now, a few other, beside those examples, a few other elements about our approach. It's processual, not entitative. See, entities are these things like leaders and followers that are stable and controllable. Whereas in the case of processes, these are things like humans in their agency and their socio-material elements. They constitute in producing the leadership. So our practice approach is not encased, you see, in speech. We look at the totality of the practices, including like the material artifacts, the technologies, the tools, the physical arrangements, the rituals. And another advantage is that we have the chance to move beyond the mere interactive or relational to what we might call a transsubjective collective orientation, in which case we might be able to transform our immediate relationship, our embeddedness, if you will. Now, an example from the leadership field, this is from another approach of mine that I call leaderful practice. We like to say that leadership is concurrent, not serial. So what I mean is that when leadership is serial, once you assume the position of leadership, you don't give it up. Well, unless, like in our country, you're impeached. You don't give it up otherwise until replaced by the next person. So it's serial. But we would prefer to say that leadership is concurrent. There are many people, practices, material movements that all contribute to leadership, all at the same time. Another key distinction is that in LAP, leadership is an unfolding process. So it doesn't require any designated roles, especially like leader and follower. In fact, it seems these days that we rarely talk or ask about leaders. If we use the word in research, it brings to mind too many cultural norms and scripts regarding the behavior of being in charge. And so the resulting commentary often incorporates this romantic manner of discourse that attends to this role. See, we are interested in the unfolding processes that create leadership. So what does it do to some traditional concepts? Well, followership as an example. If you really use the word as it was meant to be used, it tends to mean doing what you were told, right? But see, LAP resists some of these role distinctions. And even from a leaderful point of view, if I don't believe that leaders need to be out in front, then for sure, I don't believe that we need followers to get back and take their place in line. In which case, maybe followership has become a bit outdated. Now, how about this distinction that I know you read about all the time between management and leadership, with a list of managerial attributes on one side of the page and leadership on the other. And of course, leadership always wins. So in my mind, the distinction between these two is merely a fantasy, especially to line the pockets of pundits who make a living out of highlighting the gallantry of leaders. Now, I know managers are usually bureaucratically appointed and they have position power throughout, especially the middle of the organization, but they don't have to be hired hands. And by the way, we discovered the root word for management is manus, from the Latin for hands. They don't have to be hired hands who are condemned to unimaginatively carrying out corporate goals or just obeying or endorsing the status quo. Now, turning back to research, you may have seen this research onion. It's a methods classification tool from Saunders et al. And what I've done here is I've mapped out the zone in this vector space of what we might call LAP's territory. Let me just bring out a few of these elements. At the bottom here, you're noticing pragmatism, which says that our view of reality is based on an intersubjective understanding or consensus among participants to the object. And our method of inquiry is, well, I see the word inductive here. It's not so much abductive, I'd rather say abductive. So in the sense that we seek plausible explanations for phenomena that are puzzling or discrepant. It's also interpretivist. Our research is dedicated to gaining an in-depth insight into the lives of people so we can gain an empathic understanding of why they act the way they do. Now, not listed in any place here, I'd say our approach also is praxis-oriented, meaning that it looks not to historically located truths, but to involving embodied everyday activities and accomplishments. So it doesn't derive from representation standing apart or at a distance, but in a pragmatic sense, we look to direct material engagements with the world. So here are some tenets of LAP and some of other as practice approaches. Here's some tenets of our methodology. And of course, I'm not going to go through all of these, just going to pick one or two here. The relationship between the researcher and the participant. We believe it's important to sort of walk aside the participants as fellow learners, as co-respondents, where our interest is in engaging participants and understanding their practice dynamics. And then the last bullet there, our normal canons of verification and validation are different. For example, we would use criteria such as credibility, which would be established through, let's call it, extensive documentation and thick description. And of course, triangulation using diverse data sources and multiple ways of knowing. here are some others. Again, just picking a couple, and you're going to have all of these available if you get the recording. The last one on phenomenology. People know that this is a tradition that I use quite a bit in LAP. We take the phenomenological attitude to open up to the other, to see how they see the world in different ways. And to do that, we bracket our understandings and knowledge and assumptions. That means we try to suspend judgment so that we can open up to the other. So lastly, then, what are some trends and opportunities for you to engage in LAP and other as practice research? Again, you're free to open this up if you get the recording, but also we can return to this in our third segment if there are any of these you'd like to explore in more depth. Well, again, the first one, we consider agency not just at the individual level, but agency can be collective. So this can be extremely useful to some of you who are studying social change, especially social movements, you know, maybe like an application like Occupy or Gilets Jaunes or Gezi Park. These are great opportunities in terms of place to examine LAP processes. In the second case, you see we're talking about OD and what happens when you view it as a consequence of activity rather than a cause. So I think right away, then, if you're looking at change, it's not in the people that you're examining, it's in the practices. So how does that change your viewing? And then in the last case there, the role of material elements. In Sergi's work, a chapter in the LAP book, she says that material elements have three key properties. They direct, they shape, and they order. You know, sometimes, you know, when you have Post-its on the board, you know, they actually set a priority in many cases of the elements that you're considering in a project. Let's look at the next page. I know many of you from related fields, action research, or other plural models, shared leadership, distributed leadership. I mentioned OD. Some of you are familiar with CCO, the Communicative Constitutional Organization. These are related so much to our methodology that I think we can find linkages there. And I'm very interested in the very last one, frankly, because it affects me all the time. And I reflect on it quite a bit in the sense of trying to figure out how I can express my autonomy or even resistance in my own research when faced with a leadership paradigm that is nearly universally associated with charisma and individual agency. Okay, last slide. I'm reminding us of these challenges from John Van Manen, a pioneer in qualitative methodology. And he said something at the very first line that is kind of curious, because I think many of us are brought up thinking that in qualitative research, you want to take the role of the author. But no, Van Manen said, no, become the detective. So like even in the interpretive zone, which is the second there, you know, confront your own subjectivity when interpreting and theorizing. And even as you get to the bottom layer, looking at theorizing and patterning, try to find contradictory evidence, awful rival explanations. So I guess in closing here, and from Van Manen, I guess I just have to remind you, you're all on the case. Okay, I'm going to turn it over next to Marian, who will talk about the meso level.
Okay, thank you very much. I think you're just going to come out of sharing your screen, and then hopefully I can share mine. Hopefully with more success than the last time we did this, when I had tremendous internet connections, which was an absolute nightmare. So I'm thinking fingers crossed that none of that's going to happen this time. Okay, well, this is looking good so far. I have slides, so let's proceed with optimism. So as Joe has already said, we're looking at the macro, the meso and the micro levels here, and this is the meso level. And this is the reason for talking about ethnomethodology is that, if you like, it was a forerunner of LAP. It was at the time when I was doing my PhD and I was using ethnomethodology as an approach. We were kind of on the outskirts of polite society. We weren't very popular. And I'm glad to say that LAP as a movement has brought ethnomethodology much more into favour, and its qualities have been recognised. So it's nice to have this opportunity to talk about it as a forerunner of LAP. So in doing that, I'm actually talking about ethnomethodologically informed ethnography, rather than just ethnomethodology, and I'll explain a little bit about why I'm doing that later on. But I want to start with the ethnography bit of that. So ethnography are the methods, if you like, and ethnomethodology is the overarching methodology or philosophy. So ethnography, I love this description of it as the art of purposeful hanging around. And what we're really saying there is we're not specifically interviewing someone or specifically answering a research question. We are very much open to everything that's going on around us, to the social milieu in which we are working. And you can see these three quotes here suggest just three of the ways that that might actually play out, and the way that that might be useful, if you like, the things that we might see, we might come across if we're doing that purposeful hanging around. So ethnography came from anthropological roots, and in that context it was literally about going to a completely unknown setting, unknown society, and coming as an outsider to try and understand what was going on in that social setting and the meaning of actions and events to the members of that setting. So when we bring ethnography into the workplace, into the office, and in our case particularly into the study of leadership, we want to keep that anthropological strangeness. Clearly, it isn't quite that strange. We do know something about what goes on in offices. We do know something about what leadership looks like and how it might be interpreted. But we try as far as we can to put aside what we think we know, in order to keep that anthropological strangeness, to be open to what members of the setting are telling us that events and actions mean to them, not to put our own understanding of it over the top. So that brings me back to this idea of ethnomethodologically informed ethnography. I'm trying to say it 3 times, Joe. I know you said you weren't going to, but I'm trying to get it in 3 times. So we've got ethnography as, if you like, the method of data collection, fieldwork, participant observation, and so on. We've then got the ethnomethodological mindset, and that's very much about what we think we're aiming for, what we're trying to do. And it's about explication, description, detail, rather than explanation. We're not trying to offer explanations of things. It's about surfacing stuff that's already there rather than interpreting it. We are accepting the interpretations of the people in the setting. And it's about making visible rather than theorizing. I'll say a little bit more about this later, but basically it's the idea that we don't need to theorize what's there. Why would our explanation, our theory of what's going on, be any better than those of members of the setting, who are already just getting on with their lives on the assumption of what they see and what they understand, and it's working perfectly for them? Why is our explanation going to be better than that? So it's this idea that we can't be, if we were completely, purely ethnomethodological, we wouldn't write anything up, we wouldn't publish papers, we wouldn't theorize, we wouldn't do anything. And clearly that's not really practical from an academic point of view. But we use this mindset to inform how we do, for example, our ethnography. So on that basis, what is ethnomethodology? Well, it is the study, that's the ology, of the methods, self-explanatory, by which organisations or members of a setting, that's the ethno bit, the group of people who are in some way cohesive, make sense of the everyday world around them and how they make that accountable to others. So that's not accountable in the sense of being held to account. It is how they make it make sense, how they explain what it means to them and therefore sharing in what it means to other people. So it really is about making the ordinary visible. Now, I've already said it doesn't theorize, it is pre-theoretical. It's looking at how the social order that everybody takes for granted and that a lot of sociology schools will use as the basis of their theorizing, how that social order actually occurs, how it is accomplished on a minute-by-minute basis. And in offering mere description, it has previously been seen as inferior, as lacking in legitimacy. But the development of LAP has given it a legitimate home and shown the value of what it does. So these characteristics of ethnomethodology have two key consequences. Oh, I have just lost 3 of my slides, so I have no idea what's happened there, but I will talk to them and they will no doubt appear in the final version, I hope. So the 2 consequences that I wanted to talk about, no, I beg your pardon, they are in the right order. I'm completely losing the plot, do excuse me. So what does this mean for leadership? It means that this is, what we're looking at is the missing what. If you theorize leadership, if you come up with, authentic leadership is something that I've studied. It's got 4 components in a psychometric. Can leadership really be that simple, that condensed? No, it can't. Of course it can't. So what ethnomethodological studies of work try and do is to restore that missing what, to restore the messiness, the mundane practices, the quiddity of how leadership is accomplished moment by moment, practice by practice. One of the consequences of that is this idea of indexicality and situatedness, which other approaches would try and eliminate. In putting together a theory, you would try and make it as generalizable as possible. We're saying, no, we don't want to do that. We want that indexicality. We want that situatedness, because that's what gives us the meaning of this action in this context by this person. And that's where that true meaning really is. It's the just whatness of an activity in its context. So that's what we want to bring back into the study of leadership. Now, on the basis of the fact that it doesn't theorize, which we've already talked about, ethnomethodology is a foundational discipline, i.e. it takes as its subject matter the phenomenon that other approaches to sociology take for granted and that they just use as a resource for their inquiry without really thinking about whether that is justified or not. So the social world, the environment in which we live in is assumed to happen automatically, to happen unproblematically, and that therefore we can take it for granted. But what ethnomethodology does is to dig under that and say, well, how is that accomplished? Is it really unproblematic? How do those mundane practices lead to that understanding of social order that we actually have? And it's these ethnomethods, these way of making sense of and making visible those practices and those actions that we are really focused on. And this is where we come into events in the social order. So my apologies for getting that completely out of order. And what we're saying here is that, as I say, even though it might look like it's completely normal, it happens every day, it's completely unproblematic, we want to get under the skin of that and look at how the social context of the actions and the actions themselves are intrinsically inseparable. They hence make sense of each other. An action only has meaning in the context of its setting and in the context of the way in which it's enacted. Similarly, if we then apply that to leadership, leadership is only leadership because members of a particular setting intersubjectively agree between themselves that that is their shared understanding of this act by this person in this setting. So as an example that I came across in some of my research, I was looking at a college leader in a higher education college, and he had very clear views about wanting a nice, clean, constructive environment in which his students could study and his staff could work. So if he went out into the playground and he saw litter and he picked it up, that was him setting a good example. It was him enacting what he believed was appropriate to create that good working environment for everybody. It was an act of embodied leadership. If the janitor had done it, it would have just been an act of embodied janitorial work. So it was the specific act by the specific person in that specific setting that made it what it was. One of the consequences of this is that ethnomethodology doesn't subscribe to the structure-agency debate. We don't see that as relevant or helpful. We see structure and agency as mutually elaborative rather than being in tension. You can't have one with the other without the other. They both support and elaborate each other. So that's one consequence. The other one, and this is something that Joe's already talked about, is the processual character of action. So ethnomethodology goes where the action is. We're looking at those everyday, mundane, routinely accomplished situated practices, and we're surfacing what they're really about, what they're really demonstrating, what they're really enacting, as a way of really getting to the heart of how leadership happens. Not who does it, but how it happens. So in terms of methods, ethnomethodology doesn't have methods as such. We've already said that it's pretty much open to whatever kind of data it can get, but it does have some requirements of method. And these are the four that are stated as being quite important. I'm not going to go through in the detail because at least two of them are pretty obvious, but there are a couple that I want to focus on. One of those is unique adequacy, and that is the idea that as a researcher going into a setting, you gain what is referred to as vulgar competence in the activities of that setting. You know how to go on in that setting. You know what's happening enough to be able to join in. And then the last one, which relates back to the idea of theory, is this idea of indifference. And that is saying that we will accept the explanations, the sense-making of the members of the setting at face value. We're not going to say that we can decide which is the adequate or the correct or the appropriate explanation of what's going on in the setting. Whatever the members of the setting think is happening, that's what's happening, because that's their reality, that's what they respond to. Hence why our laying of theory over the top, i.e. suggesting that we have some better explanation of what's going on than they do, would be completely superfluous and is something that ethnomethodology doesn't do. The other two in the middle, as Joe has said with his slides, you can revisit those at your leisure, but I think those two are worth just drawing out. Now, obviously, we, the researcher, are in the field in undertaking ethnography with this particular lens, but we also have to be aware that we're in the text, and we have to balance our voice in the text with the voice of the participants. And particularly, we have to recognise that our voice is of no more value than theirs. Hence why our theorising wouldn't add anything to their, if you like, lay theorising of what's going on. So we have to be very, very careful that we're putting forward their voice, not our voice. Which brings us back to leadership, and specifically to leadership as mundane work. It's not visionary, larger than life, heroic leadership. It's not the visionary speech. It is the ordinary skills of talking, writing, listening, planning, being with people, going to meetings, all of that stuff that we call upon in order to organise and make sense of our everyday lives. That is what leadership, the doing, the accomplishing of leadership actually looks like and feels like, and how it takes place. And that's where we focus on the practice and practices of leadership. So just to return to this point that we don't theorise, it's not adding any value, it's not what we do. We provide the resource for others to theorise. We're not against theorising per se, but we are making the grossly observable. We are surfacing it and making something that is normally taken for granted, something that actually people recognise the value in focusing on. That means we don't fetishise methods. We're not interested in methods in particular. We will gather any information we can, wherever we can, and we will use that, we will let that emerge and let it tell its own story about the social order of the setting within which we are interested. So finally, just to come back to this point that ethnomethodology has found its home in LAP, it is happy to have found its home, and to come back to what we're really trying to do here in terms of what leadership is. This little diagram, he's supposed to be the abominable snowman. I know he doesn't look very abominable, but that comes back to a quote from Venice and Nanas, that leadership is like the abominable snowman whose footprints are everywhere, but who is nowhere to be seen. What we're trying to do with ethnomethodology is to get a little bit closer to seeing the abominable snowman rather than just his footprint. We're looking to find the animal of leadership in the foliage of everyday practices, if I can put it that way. So that's the meso level. I'd now like to hand back to Jenny, who is going to talk about the micro level in terms of her own particular study. I will stop sharing that and hand over to you, Jenny.
Thanks. So I am going to go to video ethnomethodology, and I'll talk about that in relation to leadership as practice, but also other as practice disciplines. So although my study is particularly in the field of leadership as practice, I'm aware that we've got people here from other disciplines and other fields of interest. So I'm just going to start with a couple of things that I learned. And I want to acknowledge a centre of excellence in the as practice view of the world, which comes out of Warwick Business School. While I was getting my head around all of this, I went to, I think, 3 or 4 different workshops or summer schools or even winter schools or whatever. So if you're really curious about the as practice, I think there's a group called Process, Practice and Institutions. I think it's PPI. But just to say that they really run a rich series of interactive opportunities that are low cost and very much focused on early scholars trying to get it's a new way of thinking. It's a different way of thinking. So important that you find a tribe where you can talk about this stuff. So one of the things that Davide Nicolini introduced us to in a summer school in 2019 is how do you kind of draw a picture for yourself about where practice sits? And so we link practice to process, and then we differentiate it from routines. Often process is described as a becoming ontology. And I find that helpful, but not very helpful. So where I think process leads me is this idea that the world is ever changing, that it never stands still, that especially when you're looking at social sciences, it makes a nonsense of this idea of a set of variables, because if the world is changing on a moment by moment basis, how would you ever fix a variable? Let alone how would you ever fix multiple variables, right? So the way I bring process to life is I use a very famous saying, I think it's Chinese, it's you can never step twice in the same river. So process for me is about the continuing and evolving nature of life. And by the way, this is baked into our cosmology as well, because as you know, we started with the Big Bang and our universe is actually expanding. And apparently, I read just last night that our universe is expanding at the same rate that our hair grows. It just happens that we can't see it. So we think our world is static, but it's actually not. So a process ontology helps us to foreground that. And then practice sits within a process ontology, but has some very specific attributes. I like Joe's way of describing what a practice looks like. He says it's a coordinative effort by participants who by their own rules achieve a distinctive outcome. So practice has a beginning and an end. So you can bracket a practice, you can see a practice. Now a routine is different yet again. So I'm quoting from Katerina Dietrich at this point and David Siddell, who write that a routine is a specific set of actions by a specific set of people in a specific sequence. So we're not looking for that level of specificity in practice, but you can see how when you're writing about this, when you're submitting to editors, you need to get those three different lenses very clear in your mind. And this was a very helpful way that Davide Nicolini helped bring that to life. Now, as you'll know, and as Joe has mentioned, a lot of this rests on the philosophy of the pragmatists. So it comes out of Peirce, Dewey, James, and more recently, Rorty. And the thing that I like about the pragmatist philosophy is it actually suggests that we continually ask the question, why does this happen? Why does this happen? Why does this happen? And the pragmatists say, actually, that's the wrong question. You know, if you look at the way knowledge is created by human beings as we come into the world from babyhood, a baby is not asking why. A baby is just asking what. What do I want? What do I get? And they don't care about the motivation of their mother to, you know, to secure the future generation of the family. The baby just cares about being fed. So a pragmatist philosophy says, and this is why Marian keeps talking about, we're less interested in theorizing and we're really much more interested in what's happening, getting to, you know, the activity and how that is constructed. And then I want to add in where I have done some personal research, which is on the Buddhist philosophy. So there is some writing, especially after James. He was influenced by Buddhist philosophy. It's not widely acknowledged, but it is there in the literature. And the thing I like about Buddhist philosophy is it provides what's called a flat ontology. It says that nothing is more important than anything else. So you're literally saying everything's important and I won't give primacy to anything. And I find that very helpful. And again, it drags you away from finding variables. So does that happen first and then this and then this? It's very much more emergent and allows us to look at everything. Okay, and so from that background, within the leadership as practice, my argument is that we have three specific things that sets leadership as practice, and this might apply to other fields. So strategizing as practice, entrepreneurship as practice, marketing as practice, for example. So I'm not making my claims for those other fields, but I'm interested if you're a scholar in these other fields, if you think this might be true as well. So my argument is that an as practice lens, when applied to leadership, draws us to the conclusion we should not be looking at entities. So entities disappear. That is not who does it, but how it's done. It also suggests that our beliefs are non-substantive. That means that no one can ever be the same. So as soon as I am on this Zoom, as soon as I am in an interaction with you, I am changed. I cannot remain the same person. As soon as I touch or interact with things or other people, I am changed by that. And yet we keep insisting that human beings and entities and objects remain the same. Yet through the pragmatist philosophy and the Buddhist philosophy, I would argue very strongly that we are always changed. We're always in process of being changed. And I'd also argue that it's a non-compositional view of the world, that when we look at a group, we're not just adding up this person with this person with this person and saying that makes the group. I'm arguing that the group is always more than the sum of the parts. And so actually Klein and Klawowski, I think it's said, can't be sure of that, they would call that compilational, but because I had non-entitative, non-substantive, I made it non-compositional, but the actual academic word is compilational. And I've published on this in Leadership last year with my co-author, Phil Renshaw. So that's just some opening preliminaries. I'm going to talk now about my work and how I brought these 3 ideas, which I applied to leadership as practice in my study. So the first thing I set about doing is, because I wanted to work non-entitatively, non-substantively, and non-compositionally, I had to figure a way of seeing that and working in that way. So my first way of doing this was through some very primitive drawings. And I used drawings as a way of getting underneath my assumptions and getting underneath other people's assumptions. And I asked people to just draw leadership. You know, when you think about leadership, what do you draw? And sometimes I got little stick people, and sometimes I got little networks of people. And then what the real aha for me was when I began to get arrows. So these ideas of movement and vectors, and people coming together in order to create movement. And so this is the arrows, or the vectors, are my way of engaging or using this idea of non-entitative, non-substantive, and non-compositional. So drawing was a way of capturing something that was happening in the creation of leadership for me. And then I stuck video cameras in meetings. They were big strategic meetings. And I suggested to people that we would watch back those videos. So I videoed them. And then a month later, I went back and I showed them the video of themselves. I taught them a series of vectors so that they could watch the video and they could draw out what they were seeing of themselves. So you can see some of the vectors on the right-hand side: adding, advancing, aggregating, appreciating. And at this point, I need to acknowledge Iszatt, who was involved in the very early stages of those vector developments and the arguments that we had back and forth. And at one stage, there were 4 or 5 of us having a discussion about these vectors. And actually, Iszatt said, we should get this on video as well. So we actually turned the video on ourselves to video our discussion about how to draw leadership and how to note and code what we were seeing on the videos. So then I asked them to use this idea of vectors and draw themselves. So as they watched the video, they drew the practice of leadership as they saw it. And I was influenced in this decision by some work by Rick Edema at King's College. He's a medical investigator, and he uses video ethnography to watch how practices combine in hospitals. And so one of the things he says is nothing about us without us. So inviting your participants to be part of the research, which is slightly different to action research, because they are, in this case, they're reflecting on it. They're not actually taking interventions in real time. So I just want to sort of try and draw this to a conclusion and remind you, I don't know if you've all seen the video of the gorilla. There's a team of people. It's a very famous psychological experiment. There's a team of people. You're given the instruction to watch the people in the white t-shirts as they pass a basketball and they play catch. And you're given the job of counting the number of times they throw the basketball. And because you are so absorbed in counting, you don't see that there's a big hairy gorilla walking through the video. It's a really famous psychological experiment about how we direct our attention. And the point I would like to make is we are obsessed, particularly in leadership, with these individuals, these heroic, formidable people, and we are missing something. We're missing the gorilla. And I set out in my study to use video ethnography to make sure that my gaze was not on the gorilla, not on the ball being passed, but I was looking for other things that were happening. And so the use of video ethnography allowed me to watch something again and again and again. It allowed me to take those examples back to the participants themselves and say, what do you see? And because I wanted them to make sure that their gaze wasn't just on the individuals, I turned their gaze to practice by using these vectors and by getting them to draw what they saw. So I didn't use speech, for example. I didn't use denote any job titles, for example. I just wanted them to see the practice of leadership. And so my argument in a forthcoming article is that we have, despite 100 years of leadership theorizing, we have been mesmerized by this idea of individuals as hero leaders, and we have absolutely been missing ideas of collaborative and collective leadership. So if you are interested in video ethnography, it is very strongly aligned to as practice, the as practice lens. So I highly commend it to you for your research if you want to. I've given you some references here. And I think that we have somebody who is just starting out or is mid-study. So I'm going to conclude at this point and actually ask Charlotte to, if she's brave enough, share her research question and where she's up to. And Joe and Marian and I are going to not coach her live, but we're going to use this as an example of how as practice lens might help or deepen or shed new light on a study. And then we're going to open it up for questions, but we thought a live example of a case study of work in progress would be helpful. Charlotte, lovely to see you. I'm going to stop sharing. Do you have slides or do you just want to talk to your research for now?
Yes, I have some slides, two actually.
Okay.
I will share.
You want to introduce yourself while you're sharing?
Yes. Hi, my name is Charlotte. I am junior professor at the Technical University of Chemnitz. So I'm based in Germany, but I also worked for an Austrian university, the Johannes Kepler University, where this project is actually based. So I actually have not so much experiences with leadership as praxis research. So I'm not the first author in this project, but I hope I will present it so that you can understand, and I hope I will get some feedback. So we can do it better or improve it or whatever. So I will start. So the title of our project is Work in Process for sure, Organizational Resilience During Crisis and Praxis. So since maybe not everybody knows what organizational resilience means exactly, I will start by a definition. Organizational resilience refers to the ability of the organization to anticipate trends and threats, to cope effectively with unexpected events, and to learn from these events in order to produce a dynamic capability that is directed towards facilitating organizational change. And regarding organizational resilience, for sure, crisis and other major adverse events do play a crucial role. So our aim, so we are conducting bigger research project on organizational resilience in healthcare organizations during COVID-19. So up to now, we conducted approximately 100 interviews with hospital and healthcare leaders in Austria, Switzerland, and Germany. And we also, included in this project is also a case study approach, which includes up to now 40 interviews. We hope that we will be able to conduct more. And yeah, we have different levels in this case study. We have the top, middle, and operative management level. So our research questions are which leaders' resilience practices were applied by by middle leaders while coping with COVID-19 with the COVID-19 crisis. And here we aim to to identify a professional and private praxis. I think that was a wrong name for this, but I hope you know what I mean. And we also want to know how are the ward leaders' resilience practice affecting the resilience of healthcare professional teams in terms of a trickle-down effect, and the division leaders in terms of a trickle-up effect. And we also want to know how the resilience of the hospital is affected by the resilience of the affected wards and divisions. So it is a part of the study is about praxis, and a part of the study is about organizational resilience. So yeah, that is our approach.
Thank you, Charlotte. So why are you attracted to an as practice lens on this particular study? What do you think an as practice approach could help enrich or enliven?
I think a lot what is going on every day in these teams, and we know that ward leaders or middle leaders have a crucial role in these hospitals. We know that from previous research and also from previous interviews, and we think that these everyday practice might be more crucial than we expected before. So we thought, because we investigated various aspects of resilience and all that's what is related to this. So, but I think what happens every day is very crucial for for the whole organization, for one part, but also especially for the related areas, for example, the teams and also for the division leaders. So this was our idea behind it. But I cannot say so much about the data, because my colleague is doing the data collection, and we are still in the middle of it. So yeah, I cannot say a lot about that.
Might I offer just a few thoughts? I've taken some notes on some possible modifications that would probably bring in more of an LAP approach. Would that be helpful? Okay. Just a couple of things that came to mind as you were talking, Charlotte. In LAP research, we don't tend to look for like a specific object, a practice, or an outcome, like resilience. So in the words of the phenomenologist, we like to get back to the things themselves, as was suggested in Marian's talk about ethnomethodology. So we'd like to inquire, you see, about the intersubjective circumstances surrounding these existing practices. So, how are staff coping during this time of crisis without necessarily applying a label or an explanation about what they're doing, which we're calling here resilience. So we might look to other objects and their impact on leadership, like traditions in the healthcare system, procedures that have been used, tools, like you probably have a whole range of methods to make projections about the need for care, supplies, beds available, new beds. All of these things are part and parcel of how you contribute to leadership during this time period. And remember, researchers like to take the opportunity to be a co-participant with the staff. So, so that our inquiry again can be framed in the sense of what I called before the detective. So meanwhile, the sight of these practices in all their details are fascinating to us, because we like to take them into account as a unique context. It's what gives structure and what gives meaning to the whole notion of being a healthcare worker. And I'll just add parenthetically, we've done a study recently of where some of the emerging research tends to be issuing in the field of leadership as practice, and healthcare is among the most popular contexts, along with school education. So there must be something about that context that seems to be applicable and desirable from an as practice perspective.
Okay, that's good.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you, Charlotte, because I think that what Charlotte is demonstrating is where I was, when I was doing my I was doing pilot work, and I realized that I was very attracted to the as practice approach, but I did not know how to change my questions or look at it in a different way. And I think that what Joe has just suggested to Charlotte just tilts or pivots the study in a slightly different direction. I know we've got tons of questions flooding in on chat. I've got a constant stream going here, so I'm going to hand over. Thank you, Charlotte. Thank you so much for being brave enough to share your work in progress, and thank you, Joe, for sort of making some observations here. Marian, you're going to invite some questions. I know we've got some coming in already. Thanks.
Yes, absolutely. We've got some great questions on the chat, so I'm going to actually go to people with those first. But hopefully, while we're talking about those, other folks will be coming forward with either questions that prompts or questions that they've just not had time to type yet. So I'm going to take the first one myself, because I think it was prompted by what I was doing. But I'm very happy for other people to throw in their thoughts on it as well. It was a question from Vikas, who says, can phenomenology be used as a method for ethnomethodology? Which I think is a great question. And I think Joe's comment that phenomenology is about getting back to things themselves is quite helpful there. So phenomenology is, not surprisingly, about the phenomena. I think ethnomethodology, whilst it is about the phenomena in the sense of practices, it is also about the sense making around those practices, around making them visible, making them accountable. So I would say that they are different, but they are both foundational. I would see them as having that in common. Jenny, I don't know if you want to come in on that one as a fellow ethnomethodologist, if that's the word.
So I think the trick, if you like, or the fine line that you are trying to walk is to know what the phenomenon of interest is without having such specificity about it that you are not working inductively and abductively. If you've got so much theory about the thing that you're looking at, then you're not able to look at the thing. And so you have to keep a naivete about your gaze. And that's extremely difficult because, of course, as we all start our research, we do a systematic literature review and we define our terms, which we're required to do. And somehow that we lose our pristine gaze. So I think that's what I'd say about it is a return to the thing itself with a naivete. Yeah.
Yes, it's like the anthropological strangeness, isn't it? We need to put aside all the things we think we know, we think we take for granted. Joe, anything you want to add on that one?
Well, only that they're very much intertwined. I think of phenomenology as the frame from which we derive our ethnomethods.
Yes.
And there are certain principles that I think can be applied here, especially the epoché in phenomenology, where you suspend judgment to kind of really just understand the experience to the best you possibly can. And I would even, for some of our participants here, add what we know about hermeneutics here, especially the hermeneutic circle, where we try to interpret not only what we are seeing, but we interpret, as in the case of the second circle, we interpret what the other thinks she or he is seeing, and then we kind of exchange that together, all designed to kind of really try to hone in on the experience to the best possible extent.
Brilliant, thank you. I think some great additions there. The next question was from Ibrat, and it was specifically for me, but I am going to throw it out to my colleagues as well. And Ibrat says, it seems likely what you described is strongly constructivist, yes, which raises a question, is there such a thing as leadership other than what we make it to be? I would say no, which is clearly a very short answer, but it's not about what, I think it depends who the we is in that sentence. I think the we in that sentence has to be members of the setting, not we academics. But leadership to them is what they make it, what they intersubjectively negotiate it and understand it to be. And it's no good saying, that person is the leader, if they don't orient to what that person is doing as acts of leadership, as accomplishing leadership on a moment by moment basis. Doesn't matter what you call it, it ain't leadership. So no, I think that's absolutely right. Joe, Jenny, do you want to add anything on that one?
Yes, one of the bits of video that is most striking in my study is everybody in the room that I'm videoing has a very, very senior title, including the word leader. And when they watch themselves, there's a 10-minute segment where they watched themselves and they coded using the vectors that I'd given them. And they concluded that they were not producing leadership, that despite their title, all their conversation was circular, and that this wasn't generating forward movement. And they, in their own words, considered it to be not leadership. So they were very happy. Well, they weren't happy to watch themselves, but they were very honest in their appraisal and their conclusion that was not leadership. They were a bunch of people having a conversation, but it wasn't leadership.
That leads so nicely into the next question, which was specifically for you, that I'm going to go to that now and then come back to Joe if he wants to talk about that question in a minute. So this was around the idea that does videotaping those you observe provoke demand characteristics, i.e. are they performing or are they behaving naturally? And are there ways to make it more likely that they will act as they usually would? Very good question.
So let's take this again. I'm aware that other people on this are not just fixated in the way I am on leadership. So let's think about this in terms of strategizing and knowledge creating and entrepreneurship and marketing and things like that. So the trick with video ethnography is to be there long enough that people cannot sustain impression management.
Yeah.
And to capture them in the process of doing what they do in a way that they are fully absorbed in whatever it is they're doing. So if they're strategizing, that they are fully engaged and fully absorbed in strategizing, and they have no mental capacity, they have no ability, they have no bandwidth left to perform to the camera. So I was there for days and days, and I collected hours and hours of video, and I made sure I was in meetings where the subject matter that they were discussing was so difficult and so dangerous and so pernicious, and it had such an effect that there was no way that they were looking out of the corner of their eye at the camera. And I checked with them. So I did interviews after this, and I said, how did you feel about having a camera in the room? I had multiple cameras in the room. How did you feel about that? And they all said, I forgot within 5 minutes. I
was going to say, I think it's remarkable how quickly they do just get on with their work and forget about us. I had examples. I wasn't videoing people, but I was sitting in the background while they were doing whatever they were doing. And I had numerous occasions where they would say something, or they would express something in a particular way. And then they would suddenly remember that I was there, and they'd almost go, "You're not going to mimic that, are you?" And I think for me, it was that sudden coming out of being completely engrossed that was a measure of quite how engrossed they'd been and quite how much they had forgotten that I was even there and who I was. Joe, we've had a couple of good questions there. Do you want to come back on either of those before we move on to the next one?
Just to again remind people about why it may be dangerous to use the word leader in your inquiry.
Yeah.
You know, we're looking for changes. We're looking for movements in trajectories, in turning points. So it's the outcome, you know, not the input to our processes that are going to help us identify leadership. But if you use that word, someone asked about performance, right? By the way, performance has a couple of meanings, you know, in ethnography. We also refer to it as the very activities. But I think what the questioner was suggesting is, you know, performance as a kind of acting. And it strikes me that if you use the word leader, they will perform according to that designation. We don't want that. We want the pure, as Marian has referred to in ethnomethodology, the pure, vulgar experiences.
Yes, I did like the idea that what I was gaining was vulgar competence. There's something very appealing about that as an idea, but it's that most basic level, isn't it? Great, we've got another question here. I'm being very cowardly and I'm avoiding pronouncing some people's names because I know some of them I'm actually not going to get right, so my apologies for that, but you are in the chat, so you are there. This is another one for Jenny, but again I'm going to ask either or both of you to respond to it. And it says, being active in the practice world yourselves, what in your experience is the key aspect about practice and process research that practitioners and policymakers find immediately interesting? And when we pitch to them for a research collaboration or co-creation, what is it that they will find interesting? I think this is quite a tricky question in some ways, because sometimes they don't find it interesting and they should. But Joe, Jenny, do you want to pitch in on that one?
No, I can't answer that because I haven't cracked that one. I think that the part of the problem is we're using practice and practitioners in very different ways. And so practice for us as researchers has a very particular sensitivity. Again, I think back to Theo Shisatsky and David Davida Nicolini, and Harry Tukis. And practice, the lens of practice is a sensitizing lens to look at the world. It doesn't mean sort of codifying and routinizing and making it normative. And when we go back to practitioners, they are looking for a kind of a normative view of the world. And, you know, a process lens, which underpins a practice sensitivity, doesn't allow for normativity. You know, it doesn't allow us to say that because it happened yesterday, it's going to happen today. And that's very frustrating for practitioners. And it's very difficult for us as researchers to explain, because we get ourselves into ontology and epistemology and flat ontologies and so on and so forth. So I've been a practitioner and I am a practitioner, but it's almost like when I'm a researcher, I have a different brain and I can't speak to the other half of me. And so help. Anybody?
I think for me, this taps into what I was saying about people didn't see the value in ethnomethodology because it was just descriptive. And that's where we have to step out of, to some extent, our practice lens and say, okay, we've used that as a way of understanding what's happening. But now we've got to be a little bit disingenuous and we've got to theorize and we've got to provide something normative if the policy world and the practitioner world is going to be interested in what we're saying. So I think it's a very hard nut to crack, and one that we're getting closer to in the sense of having validity and value in both the academic community and the policymaking community. But it is a hard one. Joe, anything you want to add on that?
Well, yes.
You've probably cracked it. Tell us the answer.
No, I haven't, but I would say that by studying situational dynamics, I think we have a role to perhaps improve them. And I think that's where we might be of some value to practitioners. So the example I might use would be in leadership development, for example. I mean, what's the typical way we do leadership development in standard leadership delivery? We take individuals, right? And we send them away to offsites, usually very exquisite places, right? And then we teach them their individual competencies, so they'll be better leaders, right? Mm-hmm. And then we say, okay, go back and do it. But what happens? They've learned, but nobody else has. And it's not an experience that is shared by anybody else. So most of the time, they spend a lot of time unlearning what it is that they just experienced as so-called best practices. You notice that word? It's an entitative word, but it's something that really requires a process embedded in the practices themselves. So the value to the practitioner is very simple. Take that developmental leadership experience and bring it to the group. Don't send individuals away. So just that very twist, that very turn shows how much value there might be in looking at the practices and changing the practices, not the individuals.
Thank you. As I say, I think that's our most difficult question so far. Now, the next question, and unfortunately, I can't pronounce the person's name, but I am going to ask them if they would like to come and raise their own question. It's about organizational resilience between family firms and non-family firms. And I think it's actually a question for Charlotte. So, Charlotte, I hope you're happy to field this one. But I'm sorry, I have no idea how I should pronounce your name, but would the person who typed that up please tell us a little bit more about what they were actually interested in there, if they're still with us. Anybody want to put their mic on and own that one? No, maybe it's somebody.
That person might have left.
Right. Okay. I will move on then, because I wasn't quite sure what the practice component of that was anyway. So, right.
Well, Charlotte is unmuted. Maybe you have a few thoughts.
Great. Go ahead.
I think maybe she mixed it up because, yeah, sure, we have organizational resilience is context specific. I can talk about a lot of that because I'm actually more a resilience researcher than a practice researcher. But I think maybe the question aimed at the point where I said we are aiming to separate professional and private practice to show, okay, how they deal with the stress, for example, in their private surrounding and their professional surrounding. So maybe this was the background of the question. So yeah, but since she is not here or he, I don't know. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Unfortunately, as I say, it looks as if the person who was asking that question might not be here to hear the answer, but never mind. Okay, we've got a few more questions that have come in since we've been answering those early ones. So I will keep pressing on. I know we've got at least another 10 minutes to go. We can run a little bit over if there's still questions coming in. So the next one from Heiko is very interesting. Giddens has this idea of a practical consciousness which can exceed a discursive consciousness. Simply put, sometimes you know how to go on, but not really how to put that knowledge into words. And he was wondering how the concept of indifference, withholding research of judgment, and withholding theorizing meshes with this idea that practitioners might also not be able to express what's going on. I think I'm going to have a go at fielding this one. My sense is that actually they are quite different. It's not whether we know or whether we can articulate. It's that we are saying we don't see any value in articulating, because our articulation will be in no way superior to the articulations, the versions of people within the setting. So the people in the setting can and do articulate. That is how they are making sense of and making accountable what is going on. But then there's no reason for us to articulate another layer of explanation over that. But if asked, we could carry on in a practical sense in that situation. So I think they are quite different. I don't know if my colleagues would agree with me on that one.
I think that's
there's a Marian, right? There's a rush to representation, isn't there? Some kind of a priori representation from theory that will connect the dots about the experience. But we delay that if even we get to it at all, because we're truly interested in the experience as it is enjoyed,
Yes.
by the participants themselves.
Thank you. That leads me nicely into a question that's specifically aimed at you, Joe, while I've got you on the screen. So, Joe, you mentioned the importance of looking for contradictions. How do you go about looking for contradictory elements in your data? That was from Margaret Coley. I hope I'm pronouncing that right.
Yeah.
Pause the thought there.
We love contradictions, you know, and we love puzzles. This is probably for an LAP-er really rudimentary to how we actually view the leadership and change and adaptation. The one way I think we can overcome the state that we're in is through handling contradictions, especially through our improvisational activities. How do we figure out things from the materials of the present situation? So surfacing contradictions and handling it by practices is fundamental to the leadership experience and fundamental to collective agency, which we consider co-constitutive with a leadership practice.
Okay, thank you.
I don't know if that helps.
Helps me. I hope it helps everybody else. I'm going to suggest, hoping she's still here, would Elena like to actually turn her microphone on, because she's made some very good observations and provocations in the chat, and I don't think I'm just going to read them out. Elena, lovely to see you. I haven't seen you for ages.
Lovely to see you too.
please pitch in and share some of your thoughts with us from what you've typed.
It's always a pleasure to be in deliberation with all of you, and thank you so much, Joe, Jenny, and Marian, for your contribution. But equally, thank you to Heiko, Ibrad, and all the community who continues to devote the energy and time in pushing each other forward, in taking stock of what is it that we are creating through this as practice perspective. So I made a couple of reflections, and I really embrace the focus that you bring to this session, especially as part of Ibrad's series of advancing our field, because we are at this most of critical junctures where we have actually been debating a process and practice perspective long enough, except I don't see us taking stock in accounting for the impact it has had in advancing our field. And that, for me, needs to be more than just merely demonstrating that we are relevant to practitioners. Mm-hmm. So for me, the point of reflection here is, how have our process and practice orientation in our studies generated the quality of knowledge in partnership with the world of policy and practice, business practice, enough for us to be able to say that in having devoted over 25 years in developing this agenda, whether we've applied it in leadership, in strategy, in project managing, in entrepreneuring, and so on and so forth, is not the point. The point is we can actually state how we are improving action, if indeed we take impact to mean that. So that was my first point that I would really invite us to take stock of.
And I know 1 or 2 people have been typing in the chat to respond to that. So does anybody want to switch their microphone on and get in there and mix it with Elena? It would be great if you did.
And I just notice at a meta level that this is a real epistemological question, because it really goes to the heart of what is knowledge and what is good knowledge. And I'm going to give way to anybody else who wants to butt in because it's a hard one. Yeah, go for it.
Well, actually, Jenny, may I quickly respond to your statement, and not necessarily to disagree, but actually for me, just this very statement is a provocation to us taking stock of the need to advance our field by moving beyond epistemology, ontology, and praxeology. We are forgetting axiology, and so far, it is only Joe's analysis that I have seen make reference to our axiology. So what is our axiology when we focus on a praxis orientation? And how is that axiology a way of accounting the difference we are actually making?
So I would say that the axiology is the working alongside and with. I mean, that is exactly the point that Marian's been making. We don't foreground our sense making, we foreground the sense making of our participants. And so that is an axiological stance that we hold very dearly. It was your earlier question about how has this shift, paradigmatic shift to as practice, made an impact in the world? I don't know how to answer that. Anybody?
Could I make
Go on, Joe.
I'd just like to make a comment and come back with another question. The comment in terms of axiology is that I would say that we rest on a kind of principled pragmatism, Elena, in the sense that we co-construct and co-negotiate ethical meaning as we engage, as opposed to relying upon ethical theory. Okay, so that's the first point, which is a very different paradigm. It's are people familiar with Alistair McIntyre's 3 rival versions? This is the genealogical. It doesn't come from tradition. It doesn't come from other ethical precepts. Now, the question though, and Jenny, you raised it, and I don't know if people really took the full sense in of what you were saying. And what does it mean to have a flat ontology? What does it mean for the world? Because we are so used to having individuals come forward, beacons of moral rectitude, right? Guide us. And Jenny was saying, in the as practice world, no such individual should hold precedence over any other experience, and certainly no more than the collective. Yet practices themselves have questionable outcomes in so many cases as well. So are we prepared to let go of the reliance on these individual leaders? And we're seeing today, with their demagogic, anti-democratic practices, right? And rely on the collective. As a collective, can we band together for purposes of resistance to oppression in other events in our world? Can we do that better than our reliance and dependence on the individual remarkable leader?
Can I just jump in? Because I'm having this argument with an editor at present who keeps asking me about the impact that the video, the leadership groups looking at videos of themselves to determine what they make of it. And the editor keeps asking me, so what was the impact? Did they make better decisions? Were they better leaders? Was this impact positive? How can How can I be sure? How can I measure it? And I'm just absolutely not going there, because who am I? Who could ever say, over what time period would we ever judge that? And also, how would we gauge the path not taken? So if they've made this decision to proceed in this manner as a group, as a leadership, they've obviously not decided to go there. So to conduct the sort of analysis that the editor is asking me to take, I would have to have a crystal ball about the value of this path that they never took, and we just can't do that. So in some ways, my increasing version of the world is that we've oversimplified things. Because we've struggled to, particularly in organization development, to live up to this evidence-based management credo. I just think it's painted us into a corner that is dangerous and simplistic.
Thanks, Jenny. Very helpful. I'm conscious that there's actually been a great discussion going on the chat, particularly in response to some of the things that Elaine has said. And Kaushik in particular, I liked your comments on frenetic skills and phronesis, but I suspect that that's a conversation that you and Elaine are actually going to carry on anyway, rather than trying to reproduce it live here. I'm also conscious of the time, and I think I would just like to ask one final question that Ibrat has raised and throw that out to my colleagues before asking Jenny to wrap up for us. So Ibrat, very good question here. If everything and everyone considers themselves or others to be leaders or perform practice leadership, then how do we researchers know that we are studying leadership? Doesn't the word leadership become redundant? And therefore, are we studying people's doings rather than anything else in particular? Just curious, he says. I think that's a very good challenge to us. So I'm going to throw that over to my more experienced colleagues. Joe, Jenny?
Jenny, I know you've been dealing with that question as well, so I'm gonna defer to you first.
Okay, so the way I had to face that question in my Viva, that how come if anything and everybody, if everybody could be a leader and everything was leadership, how come I wasn't studying group work, or isn't this just brainstorming? Or so the way I thought about it was, I thought about this trajectory that all organizations, so strategizing, marketing, organizing, any of the zings that you want to put into your field, whatever your field is, marketing, strategizing, whatever, will have a trajectory. And for me, what the expression of leadership was when that trajectory was changed. And I lent on the work of Diane Hosking and I forget her co-author. So Diane Hosking in 1989, I think, was the first person to say that and Carl Weick picked it up as well, that the job of leadership was to change the trajectory. So that may be the change in trajectory of a decision or an organization or a strategy or a marketing endeavor, whatever it is you're looking at, that it is somehow change has to occur for your phenomenon to be seen.
Joe, anything to add to that?
Just to remind people that this is called leadership as practice with hyphens. So we're looking at the practices. We're not looking at the leaders. We're looking at the practices first. Now, you may not like that, but if you do, it might give you a pathway to figure out what's happening when leadership is occurring. So first the practices, look for the changes in trajectories, look at all the things that are coming up that are changing those changes in trajectories, those turning points. And the turning points are fairly substantial things. I mean, we're not looking at just decisions. We're looking at things that really change the movement and the momentum into something unique and different. And then at that point, we can talk about leadership. But if you're going to come into it thinking about, you know, some agent kind of, you know, through some kind of specific activity, creating this vision that everybody's going to kind of follow, which is standard in most of our consciousnesses. Most cultures seem to come to it this way. If you can change that and rest a little bit and focus on those practices, there could be a new meaning and a new way of looking at things that could release us to kind of enjoy our collective responsibility. It's worth a try. The other method hasn't worked too well.
I think that's a great place to end. Thank you very much. So, Jenny, you've been too quick. I was going to say, while you're sharing your slide, please can you tell us how many alpacas you've got and whether they've got names? But you've already got your slide up, so you're too quick for me.
I'm aware that people might have meetings or other commitments, so I wanted to just finish by sharing what we're doing in the Leadership as Practice Academy. We have a series of global events. You can just take a screenshot of that slide and follow up on anything that is of interest to you in the next few weeks. And we've got an ongoing program. But I know that Heiko and Ibrat have other stuff for early scholars generally, and they want to talk to you about that. So please take a screenshot of this, and I'm handing back to Heiko.